complication, and it's an only child.
I can't seem to make you mine.
The 1960s felt loud, unforgettable, and immortal. Or at least, that is how history remembers it. But beneath the legends and icons, there were voices that flickered for a moment.
I can't stay, yes I know.
Shout to comfort me.
Then disappeared without warning. Bands that touched the charts, tasted the spotlight, then slipped into silence. This is not about the famous names. This is about the ones time almost erased. The ones you remember only if you were there. Number 15. The Third Bardo.
I'm living somewhere in a new dimension.
There is something unsettling about hearing a song that feels ahead of its own time, yet trapped inside it. The Third Bardo carried that exact contradiction. Their music did not feel like the present. It felt like a warning sent from somewhere slightly out of reach. That tension is what made them impossible to place, and even easier to forget.
I'm living somewhere in a new dimension.
They arrived with a single track that sounded unlike anything around it. I'm 5 years ahead of my time was not built for comfort. It leaned into distortion, strange rhythms, and a sense of unease that radio struggled to embrace. Audiences in the mid-60s were still adjusting to change, yet this felt like too much too soon. There was no gradual entry, only a sharp disruption. The band never had the chance to grow into their own identity. Without a string of hits or strong label support, they vanished almost immediately after appearing.
Many other times I've crawled through my mind.
Yet their sound lingered quietly in the background, influencing artists who came later. Their story feels like a glimpse of the future that arrived too early, then disappeared before anyone understood what they had just heard. Number 14. The Litter. There is a raw urgency in some bands that feels like it cannot last. The Litter carried that urgency from the beginning. Their sound was not polished or carefully controlled. It was loud, restless, and filled with tension that pushed against every boundary it could find.
Got crazy in my head.
They built a strong following in regional scenes, where energy mattered more than perfection. Performances felt immediate and unpredictable, as if something could break at any moment. That unpredictability became their identity. Yet it also limited how far they could travel beyond those local circles. Without national exposure or consistent promotion, their reach remained contained. As the industry shifted toward more refined production styles, their rough edges began to feel out of place. Slowly, the momentum faded, and the band slipped out of wider conversation. Still, their influence echoes in the spirit of garage rock that followed. Their story remains a snapshot of a moment when music did not need to be perfect to feel powerful. Number 13. The Peanut Butter Conspiracy.
Time is on our side, that's what we say.
Some bands sound like they belong to a moment so completely that when the moment fades, they vanish with it. The Peanut Butter Conspiracy carried that fragile connection to time. Their music felt colorful, light, and drifting, yet underneath, there was a quiet sense that it could disappear at any second. They blended folk melodies with psychedelic textures, creating songs that felt warm, yet slightly detached from reality. It was not aggressive or confrontational. It was gentle and almost weightless.
Tell me you love me, I will understand.
That softness worked for a brief window when audiences were open to exploration, but still rooted in melody. As the decade pushed toward heavier sounds and louder identities, their style began to feel outpaced. There was no dramatic collapse, only a slow fading. Without a defining hit that could anchor them in memory, they slipped quietly out of the spotlight. Their legacy now feels like a fading photograph, something beautiful that once existed, but is hard to hold on to clearly. Number 12. The Music Machine.
Complication, and it's an only child.
There is a certain darkness that some bands carry, not as an image, but as a presence. The music machine had that presence. From the first note, there was tension beneath the surface, as if something restrained was ready to break free. Their sound was sharper, more aggressive than many of their peers. Talk Talk cut through radio with a force that felt almost confrontational. It did not ask for attention. It demanded it. That intensity gave them a brief surge of recognition, but also made them difficult to sustain within a changing industry. Behind the scenes, instability began to fracture the group. Lineup changes and internal disagreements eroded any chance of long-term momentum. What once felt powerful became fragmented. As the structure collapsed, so did their visibility. They did not slowly fade. They broke apart. Yet their impact lingers in the edge they brought to a scene that often leaned toward brightness. A reminder that darkness always had a place in the 60s. Number 11. The Chocolate Watch Band. There is something disorienting about a band losing control of its own voice. The Chocolate Watch Band lived that reality. Their music carried a raw authenticity, yet behind the scenes, that identity was constantly being reshaped by forces outside their control. They built their reputation on gritty performances and a sound that felt honest and immediate. It was not manufactured, it was lived. But producers saw something different. They altered recordings, replaced vocals, and restructured songs without the band fully present. What reached the audience was no longer entirely theirs. That disconnect created a strange legacy. Listeners heard a version of the band that did not fully exist. The real identity became blurred between intention and production. As confusion grew, momentum stalled. Eventually, they slipped from the spotlight, leaving behind a catalog that feels both real and artificial at the same time. Their story is not just about fading away. It is about being reshaped until recognition itself becomes uncertain. Number 10. The West Coast Pop Art Experimental Band.
I've lost all of my pride.
Some bands do not just make music. They challenge the idea of what music is supposed to be. The West Coast Pop Art Experimental Band lived in that uncomfortable space where creativity pushed against expectation. Listening to them does not feel like entering a song. It feels like stepping into a shifting environment that refuses to stay still. Their sound leaned heavily into experimentation. Layers of distortion, spoken passages, and unconventional structures replaced familiar patterns. It was not designed for easy listening. It demanded attention and patience. That made it fascinating, but also difficult for a mainstream audience that still relied on clear melodies and predictable rhythm. There was no compromise in their approach. They did not soften their vision to reach a wider audience. As a result, their work remained on the edges of the culture rather than at its center. When trends moved forward, they were left behind, without resistance. Their legacy exists in fragments of influence rather than widespread recognition. A reminder that some artists are remembered not for how many people listened, but for how deeply they changed what came after. Number 9. The United States of America.
Love don't come easy, babe.
There are moments when a band sounds less like a product of its time and more like an anomaly within it. The United States of America carried that feeling from the beginning. Their music did not follow the path others were taking. It moved in a direction that few listeners were ready to understand. They combined electronic sounds with rock structures in a way that felt unfamiliar and even unsettling. At a time when guitars still dominated, they introduced textures that felt mechanical and distant. It created a sense of separation between performer and listener. That distance became both their signature and their obstacle. Without a clear place within the industry, they struggled to maintain momentum. Audiences could not easily categorize them, and labels did not know how to market them. The result was a brief existence followed by quiet disappearance. Yet their ideas did not vanish. They resurfaced years later in genres that embraced electronic experimentation. Their story feels like a signal sent too early, heard faintly then rediscovered when the world finally caught up. Number 8. The Merry-Go-Round.
Who loves me? Is thinking of me.
There is a kind of songwriting that feels too refined for the moment it arrives in. The merry-go-round carried that quiet sophistication. Their music was not built on shock or volume. It relied on structure, melody, and emotional clarity that unfolded slowly rather than instantly. At the center was Emmett Rhodes, whose approach leaned toward careful composition rather than immediate impact. Songs felt complete in a way that did not demand attention, but rewarded it over time. That subtlety became difficult to sustain in an era driven by louder statements and rapid shifts in taste. Without a defining breakthrough moment, the band remained just outside widespread recognition. They were present but never fully embraced. As trends moved forward, they slipped into the background without resistance. What remains is a body of work that feels timeless, yet oddly detached from its own era. Their story reflects how precision and restraint can sometimes be overlooked in a world chasing noise. Number 7. The Beau Brummels.
I can't stay, yes I know.
There is a strange feeling when a band sounds familiar, yet never fully belongs to the story people remember. The Beau Brummels lived in that space. Their music carried echoes of the British invasion, yet something underneath felt distinctly different. It was softer, more reflective, less driven by spectacle. They found early success with songs that fit neatly into the mid-60s landscape. There was momentum and recognition, but it never settled into permanence. As the decade evolved, their sound began to shift inward rather than outward. While others grew louder and more experimental, they moved towards subtlety and introspection. That choice created distance between them and the changing audience. Without a dramatic reinvention or a defining hit to anchor them, they slowly slipped from focus. Their influence traveled quietly into later folk and roots movements, but their name faded from everyday conversation. Their story feels like an early voice that arrived at the right time, but chose a path the era was not ready to follow for long. Number 6. The Knickerbockers.
There's no denying I've been crying.
Some bands are remembered not for who they were, but for who they sounded like. The Knickerbockers carried that burden from the start. Their music felt so close to the Beatles that listeners often mistook one for the other. At first, it created intrigue. Then it became a limitation. Their hit song, Lies, captured that similarity perfectly. It was sharp, immediate, and convincing enough to blur identity. But imitation, even when unintentional, rarely builds a lasting legacy. As the musical landscape expanded, audiences began looking for something more distinct, something that could stand on its own. Without a clear identity separate from the comparison, their momentum stalled. They were not lacking talent. They were trapped inside an expectation they could not escape. Over time, their presence faded, leaving behind a single moment of recognition tied closely to another band's shadow. Their story reflects how sounding familiar can open a door, but rarely keeps it open. Number 5. The Electric Prunes.
Reached out to comfort me.
There is a point where experimentation becomes difficult to control. The Electric Prunes reached that point quickly. Their music carried the essence of psychedelic exploration, yet behind it there was a sense that the direction was not entirely their own. Their early work introduced a sound that felt strange and compelling at the same time. It balanced melody with distortion, creating an atmosphere that pulled listeners in without fully explaining itself. That ambiguity became part of their identity, but also made them vulnerable to outside influence. Producers began steering the creative process, shaping songs in ways that drifted away from the band's original intent. Over time, that control shifted further until the connection between artist and music weakened. As identity blurred, so did their presence in the industry. They did not disappear suddenly. They were slowly redirected until recognition itself faded. Their legacy remains tied to a sound that defined a moment even as the creators behind it lost their place within it. Number 4. The Seeds.
I can't seem to make you mine.
There is a raw kind of rebellion that does not ask for permission. The Seeds carried that energy in its purest form. Their sound felt stripped down, direct, and unapologetic, as if it existed only to challenge whatever came before it. It was not refined, it was immediate. Their music leaned on repetition and attitude more than complexity. Pushing too hard became their defining statement, not because it was perfect, but because it refused to soften itself. That refusal gave them a brief surge of attention during a time when audiences were beginning to embrace something rougher and less controlled. But the shift did not last in their favor. As psychedelic music expanded and became more layered, their simplicity began to feel limited. Without evolution, their sound remained fixed while everything around it moved forward. Gradually, they slipped out of focus. Yet their influence remained embedded in the foundations of garage and punk music. Their story feels like the beginning of something larger that moved on without them. Number 3. The Standells.
I'm gonna tell you a big fat story, baby.
Some songs capture a place so clearly that they outlive everything around them. The Standells created that kind of moment. Their music carried a gritty edge that felt tied to a specific environment rather than a universal sound. It gave them identity but also confined them to it. Dirty Water became their signature. It was rough, direct, and filled with attitude that matched the mood of a changing culture. For a brief time, it placed them firmly within the conversation. But a single defining moment can be both a breakthrough and a boundary. As the decade continued, the industry demanded reinvention. Without a second wave of equally powerful material, their presence began to narrow. They were remembered for one sound tied to one moment. Over time, that memory remained while everything else faded. Their legacy is built on intensity rather than longevity. A reminder that capturing a moment perfectly does not guarantee staying within it. Number 2. The Monks. There are bands that feel like they belong to the future more than their own time. The Monks carried that strange displacement. Formed by American soldiers in Germany, they created a sound that rejected convention almost completely. It was repetitive, aggressive, and intentionally unsettling. Their music stripped away melody in favor of rhythm and tension. Songs felt hypnotic yet confrontational, as if they were designed to disrupt rather than entertain. At a time when most bands still followed familiar structures, this approach felt almost alien. Audiences did not fully understand what they were hearing. Without mainstream acceptance, their presence remained brief. Yet what they created did not disappear. It resurfaced years later in movements that embraced minimalism and raw expression. Their story is not one of failure but of misalignment with time. They arrived early, spoke loudly, then vanished, leaving behind echoes that would only be understood much later. Number 1.
July.
Floating on the air.
Some music feels like a dream you almost remember, but cannot fully hold on to. July created that kind of experience. Their sound drifted between melody and illusion, as if reality itself was bending around the edges. It was beautiful, but also strangely distant. When their self-titled album arrived, it did not make noise in the way records needed to survive. It was quiet in its impact and subtle in its design. Listeners at the time were chasing louder statements and bigger personalities. July offered something softer, more introspective, more fragile. That difference became their downfall. There was no major hit to anchor them in memory, no chart moment to freeze their existence in time. Instead, they dissolved into obscurity almost immediately after release. Years later, their work would be rediscovered and praised, but that came long after their moment had passed. Their legacy is not built on fame. It is built on atmosphere. A reminder that sometimes the most delicate sounds are the easiest to lose.
The 60s were never just about the legends you still hear today. They were built on moments like these. Voices that rose quickly, then faded before history could hold on to them. Maybe you remember one of these bands. Maybe you do not. But their echoes are still there, waiting quietly beneath everything that came after.